Do you see any different alternative, frankly, in amongst other political parties or leadership presently on that front?
There are ideas elsewhere in politics, but I'm focusing on this government because it's got another term.
I know, but I'm wondering whether there's any difference in what happened for the previous 9 years either, particularly.
The issue had been on a slow burn.
It had been on more than that, had it? There'd been more land. National would say there'd been more land sold to foreign buyers under Labour than it has done. Or?
But it didn't have the economic impact of this. So if Shania Twain buys the Motor Tapu station as she did, it doesn't have the same economic impact as this. It doesn't set a precedence with a very powerful counterparty, i.e. China Inc., that this is the way we do business in New Zealand. At some point, we had to draw a line in the sand. We should have drawn it a while ago. That this government doesn't have the intelligence or the courage to do it now.
And here's the other argument. Why is it a Chinese bidder that has to be that line in the sand? When you've got someone like James Cameron buying up farmland in the Wairarapa presently and no such fuss. And is that part of the signal that they are so determined to get out there?
No, this test should be applied to all foreign applicants to buy New Zealand assets. And I'm very distressed that this has become a Chinese thing. The government has fueled that in itself in the line it's taken. I want to make two things incredibly clear here. First of all, I'm a huge believer in foreign investment, regardless almost where it comes from. I mean, you draw the line at some countries, some companies, but certainly not in China. But it has to be foreign investment which is good for them and for us, and this isn't. And it's not an anti-Chinese thing, and this line should have been drawn in the sand a very long time ago. And in improving this decision now for a second time, the government has made it a very, very great deal harder to draw, particularly with other applicants from the States, Germany and China, who are already large investors in dairy land here.
Well, that's exactly the point. Why should this case be any different from those that have been approved from other nations?
There is a very important concept that applies to issues like this, and I'll draw a parallel with the Resource Management Act. If you're sitting in a water catchment and you want to take water to irrigate farmland, and lots of other people in your valley have been taking water and getting consents for it, if you apply for a consent and yours is the same size consent as anybody else's, but in fact yours tips that water catchment over into over allocation, in other words, there isn't enough water for natural processes, then the RMA is actually very ill-equipped to do that. We can't handle, with our laws in New Zealand, cumulative impact, which is what this is. And it's incredibly easy, and it's just so lazy for the government to say, oh, yeah, well, we'll just flag this one through because we're under a lot of pressure from China. If you don't consider those cumulative impacts, you are setting up the dairy industry here for a serious strategic
Why
knockback.
is cumulative impact reached now with this bid, when, as you said, there are plenty of bids from other nations that have gone through or that might be pending?
Because if the government approves this one, do you think they'll turn down any of the next 10 approvals from China or Germany or the United States?
Or did they turn down many of the previous 10? I mean, that's what it comes back to, doesn't it?
Kathryn, at some point, you have to stand up and say, actually, enough is enough. You have to actually say that. That's the role of government.
But this is what bemuses me. Why has this point been reached with this one? It is, in your opinion, that's certainly not what appears to be emanating from the government, quite the reverse. It appears to be the signal that, yes, this type of investment is welcome, investment in inverted commas.
This is different because unlike Harvard University's endowment fund buying land or a large German agribusiness investor buying land, Shanghai Pengxin is an integrated producer and marketer. So that's what throws us right the way back to that 100-year-old business model.
Right.
So if that milk
the vertical model of which you speak.
So if that milk was only going to Fonterra or to another New Zealand producer, and the Shanghai Pengxin was getting a payout like a New Zealand farmer would, and sharing in the upside as that sold overseas, that would be okay. It wouldn't be very clever because you'd you still want to worry about cumulative impact. It wouldn't be clever at all. But this is fundamentally different because it's an integrated model and it takes us back to the Vesties 100 years ago.
Now I see some sort of a difference, and you had alluded to it earlier, the vertical integration model, the business of from the farm gate to the supermarket.
Correct.
Well, one argument, but there's been a lot of others that I've found harder to see the difference on from other cases. Just on this point, actually, what do you make of where Fonterra is at with the fresh vote on its new structure and allowing outside investment? Just hearing from a couple of farmers this morning, not a suggestion necessarily that the vote might reverse, but is this a point in time also for those plans?
Fonterra's refreshed strategy, as it called it when it announced a couple of weeks ago, was good in the sense there was a bit more focus and drive there from where it had been in the past. But it's very disappointing because it's entirely geared to the capital it's got rather than trying to understand the opportunities it has and the capital it needs to exercise those opportunities. So, in fairness to the farmers, they have come a long way in terms of changing capital structure, and I give them full credit for that. This trading of shares is another big step for them, and I understand why it's difficult for them. And it comes back, I'll draw a parallel here with what we've just been discussing in Shanghai Pengxin. It comes back to our ability as a country to actually wrestle with complicated issues and come up with the right answers, and get people on board with that. Now, Fonterra needs to keep doing that, and fortunately the chairman, Henry van der Heyden, is skilled at that, and I think the shareholders council as well will continue to play a constructive role in that, so they'll get there eventually, but that's still a long way short of the next step, and this is what worries the farmers. It's not just about trading shares amongst themselves, it's about bringing in outside capital.
Okay.
And that, again, I'm highly sympathetic to that because that is immensely challenging too.
Do they need that capital, by the way? We heard one view this morning from former Fed Farmers president, dairy section president, that no, he believed the capital could be raised within existing farmer membership, and I heard another farmer saying no, he believed that particularly, and here's the irony, particularly for the behind-the-border investment and joint venture projects that Fonterra is getting itself involved in, external capital might be needed. What's your view?
It's the latter, in that it's very easy to argue there is enough capital. All you do is draw up a plan that matches that capital, which is what Fonterra has done. But here's a big test. The government's economic growth agenda, well, by the way, the government has actually binned its economic growth agenda. Stephen Joyce is now working on something called the business growth agenda, but that's still in development. Anyway, the economic growth agenda, which was their Mark II version, called for a tripling of exports of food and beverage between 2009 and 2025, if we were to catch up with Australia and lift our exports and all that kind of stuff. The dairy industry, all the people in it tell me, the very best hope is only doubling of dairy exports over that time. That will also require a big increase in the number of cows, so that's a bit of a pressure. So, in other words, the dairy industry on its current trajectory can't meet the government's growth agenda. In fact, it actually falls lamentably short. It could, if it was more dynamic and if it had more capital and pursued those opportunities more rigorously. And if I was a farmer, I would probably want to keep that capital that I'm contributing deployed pretty close to me in the value chain. And I want to see that overseas investment. I want to have some benefit from it. But I would like to see outside capital in that, because that's not my core business, and my reward for being invested in that is a bit arm's length. So, and I think there's all sorts of new investment vehicles that farmers and Fonterra are going to have to develop if the dairy industry is to maximise its potential for this country.
And of course that may involve, as we said, offshore joint ventures, but the difference, as I'm sure you'd be at pains to point out, is that we don't buy the land in these nations that we are investing.
Absolutely.
Whereas here, is the political debate going to get to grips with this? And it is both major parties. Sorry, I understand there's an incumbent government, but when you are making what are precedent-making decisions, there needs to be a wider debate. is this going to be thrashed out not only now but through to the election? How much is too much when it comes to the sale of our land to anybody?
The blunt answer is no. And
why not? Because people just don't switch in enough?
Yeah. I find very few people out there trying to wrestle with the issues. It's all very superficial, and it's not just around this. It's the casino. It's everything else. And I wrote in February. I wrote 3 consecutive columns about Shanghai Pengxin, analysing on farm, the processing, and then the market side of all that. I did not get a single email or a single phone call about those columns. I did subsequently have people discuss them with me, so it was a bit of a comfort that Justice Miller came out with his verdict in the process of that, because I felt that there was some sense out there. But if we have to constantly resort to the courts to try to get a bit of better level of analysis, and actually we haven't, because this OIO second approval is shockingly scanty in its analysis, then that's where we're at. And that makes me extremely nervous.
Thank you. Rod Oram, business commentator.